In February 1944, at RAF Wittering, a unit whose only job was telling pilots what would keep them alive, wrote a comparative trial report. It put Spitfire Mk XIV against Mustang III, and on maximum climb, the wording was blunt. The Spitfire was very much better. That wasn't a modern forum verdict, it was wartime assignment paper. So why do people still treat Spitfire over Mustang combat ranking as fan revisionism? The ranking was already written before the argument started. The Air Fighting Development Unit, the AFDU, had been operating since 1934, when it stood up at RAF Northolt as the Air Fighting Development Establishment. By July 1940, it had its permanent name and a permanent mandate. Run comparative trials between Allied and enemy aircraft, develop tactics, and put the results on paper for the commanders who needed them. Not a test establishment in the Boscombe Down sense, where engineers ran performance envelopes in controlled laboratory conditions. Not a manufacturer's advocacy office. The AFDU was the RAF's operational judgment unit, staffed by experienced combat pilots pulled from frontline commands, based by 1944 at RAF Wittering and operating under Fighter Command and the Air Ministry. Its mandate, in plain terms, relate British fighters to those of the enemy, develop tactics on behalf of the command, and give commanders something they could act on. These were the professionals commanders consulted when deciding which aircraft went where. The AFDU's evaluation methodology was precise about what comparison actually meant. Not an unstructured dogfight between two types, where the better pilot on the day could skew everything. A structured assessment across specific parameters, divided into two categories. Factual comparison, speed, rate of climb, range, endurance, acceleration, measured against the stopwatch, and competitive comparison, which included turning circles, rates of roll, and zoom climbs from dive. The AFDU's verdicts weren't the product of one pilot's enthusiasm on a good day. They came from a structured methodology, calibrated to operational relevance, designed to give commanders something more useful than impressions. February 1944 wasn't an academic month to be running evaluations. Operation Argument, Big Week, opened on the 20th, the US AAF's sustained daylight offensive targeting German aviation industry across 5 days of coordinated strikes. American declassified records note that the beginning of that offensive was no surprise to the Headquarters 1 Fighter Corps. The Luftwaffe had been preparing for it. Bomber losses from the preceding months were real and recent. Overlord planning was generating genuine urgency about which fighters would cover which missions, at what altitude, and for how long. The high-altitude interception threat from FW-190As and BF-109Gs wasn't theoretical. German fighters were specifically adapted for the altitudes where Allied heavy bombers flew, and the RAF's ability to counter them depended on which fighters it assigned to which sectors. When the AFDU sat down at Wittering in the weeks around that offensive to put Spitfire Mk XIV against Mustang III, aircraft assignment decisions had immediate lethal consequences. The report the unit produced, referenced in modern analyses as AFDU Report108, was that kind of document. Survival advice rendered as comparative language, not prestige ranking. Picture the setting. Wittering had been an active RAF station since 1918, built on Wittering Heath, shared during the war with the Naval Air Fighting Development Unit, and described as one of the country's centres for air defence research and development. In February 1944, under low winter overcast typical of the Midlands, AFDU pilots were taking aircraft aloft in controlled sequences, one parameter at a time, both aircraft at the same altitude and configuration, with the evaluating pilot switching between cockpits across sessions. The Mark XIV trial aircraft was itself a conversion, as the research records confirm. The Mark VIII fuselage mated with the Griffon 65, producing a machine that was noticeably different to handle and to look at from the dispersal. The Mustang III, waiting on the same strip, was a Razorback P-51B or C, the earlier canopy configuration before the P-51D's bubble, with the raised rear fuselage that restricted rear visibility. Both machines were precisely what was flying operational missions that month. Not the best-case future version of either aircraft. The aircraft commanders were actually allocating. The evaluation covered 6 parameters. On maximum speed, the AFDU recorded that the speeds were practically identical. On dive, the Mustang pulled away, as it had against the Spitfire Mk IX, though less markedly against the Mark XIV, a phrase that matters because it tells you something about how much the Griffon power had changed the equation. On radius of action, the finding was unambiguous. Without a long-range tank, the Spitfire 14 has no endurance. With a 90-gallon long-range tank, it has about half the range of the Mustang III fitted with 2 by 62.5-gallon long-range tanks. On turning circle, the Spitfire 14 is better. On rate of roll, the advantage tends to be with the Spitfire 14. And on maximum climb, the language that still anchors every serious discussion of this comparison. The Spitfire 14 is very much better. Sit with those 6 findings for a moment, because they aren't all pointing the same direction. Speed, a draw. Dive, Mustang. Range, Mustang, and emphatically so. Turning circle, Spitfire. Roll rate, Spitfire. Climb, Spitfire, very much better. 4 of the 6 parameters, 3 of the 4 purely combat-relevant ones, went to the Mark XIV. The one parameter where the Mustang had an unambiguous non-range advantage, dive acceleration, was also the one most consistent with the physics of the laminar flow wing and the Mustang's lower drag profile at high speed. The AFDU didn't hide that. Both verdicts appear in the same document. The conclusion the evaluation drew from this picture was careful and deliberate. With the exception of endurance, no conclusions can be drawn, as these 2 aircraft should never be enemies. The choice is a matter of taste. That closing line has sometimes been read as a diplomatic hedge, as though the evaluators were softening a judgment they didn't want to deliver too baldly. It's more precisely read as an accurate statement of what the evaluation was and wasn't designed to determine. The AFDU wasn't ranking aircraft for a hypothetical dogfight league table. It was mapping parameters so commanders could make informed deployment decisions. Where the Mark XIV ranked above the Mustang in combat metrics, the report said so plainly. Where the Mustang held advantages that mattered operationally, range, dive acceleration, those appeared in the same document with equal plainness. The choice is a matter of taste does not undercut the climb verdict. It situates both verdicts correctly, as context-dependent operational data, not absolute hierarchy. That precision is what makes this evaluation useful evidence rather than propaganda. The same report that wrote, "very much better," on climb, also wrote, "no endurance," on range. The document didn't advocate for either machine. It described what each one did under the conditions of the test, with aircraft that were actually available in February 1944. The Razorback Mustang III, the P-51BC variant fitted with the Packard V1653 Merlin, rated at approximately 1,450 to 1,490 horsepower and operating at the boost clearances standard before April of that year. Not the later P-51D with its bubble canopy. Not the V1657 engine that began replacing the V1653 after April 1944. The AFDU tested the aircraft that were doing the work. The machine on the other side of that comparison was itself a recent arrival. The Spitfire Mk XIV, Type 379, had been developed by mating the Mark VIII airframe with the Rolls-Royce Griffon 65 engine. That pairing produced something physically distinct from anything that had previously carried the Spitfire name. The Griffon 65 displaced 37 litres, running through a two-speed, two-stage supercharger, and delivered approximately 2,035 to 2,050 horsepower at combat ratings. The baseline for comparison is the Merlin III fitted to the original Spitfire Mark I, rated at approximately 1,030 horsepower at takeoff. The Griffon 65 nearly doubled that output. The airframe it drove was heavier than the Mark I. Loaded weight climbed from roughly 6,000 pounds to approximately 7,800 to 8,000 pounds across the marks. But that increase of around 30% ran well behind the power gain of nearly 100%. Power to weight improved substantially. The engineering argument behind why the AFDU's climb verdict reads "very much better" rather than "marginally better" begins here, in that arithmetic. The Griffon engine was audibly different from any Merlin. Where the Merlin had a high, smooth shriek at full throttle, the Griffon's larger displacement produced a deeper, almost grinding bellow. Pilots who flew both noticed it immediately. The contra-rotating propeller arrangement on some marks was absent on the standard Mark XIV, which used a conventional 5-blade propeller. That single direction of rotation meant substantial torque on takeoff, a strong tendency to swing on the initial roll that required corrective rudder. Ground crews on the dispersal, watching a Mark XIV line up, could hear the difference in the engine note before it even left the ground. Sitting in the cockpit of the February 1944 evaluation aircraft, the most immediate visual difference from any Merlin engine Spitfire was the nose. The Griffon's 37-litre V12 required a noticeably longer, deeper engine cowling, bulkier forward of the cockpit than anything the Merlin variants had needed. Those familiar rounded humps over the cylinder banks were there, but extended, stretched forward into something that blocked more of the view ahead than the earlier Marks had. 5 propeller blades instead of 4 or 3. A longer moment arm forward of the undercarriage, which changed landing sight lines and required a technique adjustment from pilots converting from Merlin Marks. The early Mark XIV used a standard framed canopy. The bubble canopy came later, so the pilot's view was already partially cut by the canopy framing. And that longer nose ahead of the windscreen was the thing you noticed first every time you settled into the seat. From the ground, you could tell it wasn't the familiar Merlin machine the RAF had been flying since 1938. From the air, the difference that mattered was that 5-blade propeller turning at the head of all that Griffon horsepower, translating power into climb rate at approximately 4,580 feet per minute in production standard configuration. Some sources cite 5,200 feet per minute for specific configurations. The Spitfire Mk XIV could reach 20,000 feet faster than the Mustang III in the same test condition could follow. The AFDU recorded the gap as very much better. Secondary analysis puts the Mk XIV's climb advantage at roughly 30% over comparable Mustang figures. The wartime trial language itself is sufficient. The gap wasn't marginal, and it wasn't something a Mustang pilot could compensate for by pushing the throttle harder. Top speed, already noted as practically identical in the AFDU evaluation, sits in the wartime trial record at approximately 446 miles per hour at around 25,000 feet for the Mk XIV. Some later sources cite 448 miles per hour under different boost conditions, but the 446 miles per hour figure is the conservative anchor from trials of service standard aircraft, and it's the one the evaluation context supports. The service ceiling reached somewhere between 42,000 and 44,500 feet, depending on configuration. At altitude, where FW-190s and BF-109Gs were conducting high-level interception runs against bomber formations in early 1944, those performance margins weren't theoretical. Now the belief correction argument can be stated precisely. The modern popular framing, the National World War II Museum describing the P-51 as the gold standard for World War II fighters, the National Museum of the USAF noting it as the primary long-range escort, countless online summaries treating it as simply the superior aircraft of the war, consistently prioritizes the Mustang's strategic and escort role without distinguishing it from pure air combat ranking. That conflation produces a specific assumption: that anyone claiming the Spitfire Mk XIV was the superior air combat machine is engaged in retroactive British advocacy, assigning nationality-biased rankings to a historical debate where the Mustang demonstrably won. The AFDU evaluation overturns that assumption directly. The Spitfire over Mustang combat ranking wasn't invented after the war. The RAF's own operational evaluators produced it in February 1944, while D-Day was still 4 months away, while aircraft assignment decisions were still live and consequential. The revisionism framing has the burden of proof exactly backwards. That institutional weight is what separates the document from forum opinion. The AFDU produced reports that commanders used. Not binding directives, AFDU evaluations were advisory rather than directive in formal authority, but the kind of professionally credible analysis that informed decisions about which aircraft went to which squadrons for which missions. When commanders in early 1944 were trying to understand where the Mk XIV fit relative to other available fighters, the AFDU was the body they asked. The unit didn't run prestige competitions. It ran assessments with operational consequences. The competitive comparison category, turning circles, rates of roll, dive zoom climbs, required both aircraft to be at matching conditions before the test run began. The pilot being evaluated would call ready. Both aircraft would accelerate to the test speed, and then the maneuver began simultaneously. From the ground, or from above, it wasn't immediately obvious which aircraft was performing better. You had to watch where one sat relative to the other at the end of a timed turn, or how much altitude one had gained over the other in a zoom climb from the same entry speed. The AFDU pilots knew what they were measuring. They had done it before, against FW-190s, against ME-109Gs, against Tempests. The methodology was standardized precisely because impressions weren't enough. Commanders needed numbers and verdicts they could actually use. One layer of evidence sits between the AFDU document and the broader pilot report record. Captain Eric Winkle Brown, Royal Navy officer, test pilot, the individual who flew 487 distinct aircraft types across a career spanning 31 years, including 14 versions of the Spitfire and Seafire, produced evaluations of Spitfire variants that have circulated widely in aviation history. In his comparative work, including his book Duels in the Sky, Brown's assessments are generally understood to draw a distinction between the Mark IX, which he regarded as the most refined handling Spitfire, and the Mark XIV, which he treated as the superior air combat machine. The Mark IX's lighter controls and more forgiving characteristics made it the better handling aircraft for pilots of varying experience. The Mark XIV's Griffon power and climb authority made it the fighter you wanted if the objective was winning the engagement, not demonstrating the most pleasant stick forces. That distinction, handling versus combat effectiveness, maps cleanly onto what the AFDU evaluation recorded at the parameter level. In Duels in the Sky, Brown reportedly placed the Spitfire and the FW-190 jointly at the top of his ranking of the greatest single-seat fighters of the Second World War. The source for Brown's specific Mark IX, Mark XIV framing in the research record is pilot report consensus rather than a primary document independently extracted in this research. So the language should reflect that calibration. Brown's assessments point in this direction. They don't constitute a separate formal evaluation alongside the AFDU's work. They reinforce the evaluation verdict rather than replacing it. The point for the broader argument is narrower. The pilot report consensus around the Mark XIV's air combat superiority over the Mustang III didn't originate in online discussions of the 2000s. It was being articulated by professional evaluators, both institutional and individual, in the period when both aircraft were in active service. Now the other side of the ledger, stated with full weight. North American aviation built 15,586 Mustangs of all variants between 1941 and 1946. The RAF alone operated 308 P-51Bs and 636 P-51Cs as Mustang Mark IIIs, with first RAF units converting to the type in late 1943 and early 1944, plus a further 828 of the later Mark IV and Mark IV-A variants. P-51B-C escort operations into Germany had already begun in the winter of 1943-1944, before the AFDU evaluation was even conducted. By the time of the first US heavy bomber strike against Berlin in March 1944, the US AAF fielded roughly 175 P-51B-C Mustangs. The P-51 could escort bombers to Berlin and back. The Spitfire Mark XIV couldn't, and the AFDU said as much in the same document. Without a long-range tank, the Spitfire 14 has no endurance. That sentence comes from the identical evaluation that produced very much better on climb. The same unit, the same trial, the same professional assessment. The AFDU wasn't softening either verdict for diplomatic reasons. It was recording what each aircraft could and couldn't do under the conditions it was tested. The strategic consequence of that range finding was decisive. Approximately 957 Spitfire Mark XIVs were built in total, roughly 1 in 16 of total Mustang production. The Mark XIV was never going to be produced at the scale needed for strategic escort operations, even if engineers had somehow solved its range limitations. The laminar flow wing that gave the Mustang its aerodynamic efficiency at cruise altitudes, the large internal fuel capacity that North American had maximized at US AAF direction from July 1943 onward, when the Air Force directed fighter manufacturers to push internal fuel to maximum. The additional 85-gallon fuselage tank that North American incorporated into the P-51B-10 production line and supplied as a retrofit kit for earlier aircraft. These gave the Mustang a strategic reach the Spitfire's airframe design couldn't replicate. The two aircraft occupied different parts of the operational picture. What the Mustang's range meant in practice was this. Escort pilots were flying multi-hour missions deep into Germany with fuel to fight, to chase, and to get home. That was the Mustang doing what the Mustang was for, being at altitude over occupied Europe with reserves enough for the engagement. The Spitfire Mk XIV, even with its long-range tank, carried approximately half the range of the Mustang III in equivalent configuration. No Spitfire could be substituted into that mission and accomplish the same result. The Mustang was the only single-engine fighter that could be over Berlin when the bombers needed cover and still be there at the end of the escort leg. The complementary role structure wasn't a post-war rationalization constructed to make both sides feel good about their aircraft choices. RAF commanders understood it in real time, in the specific operational language of which aircraft went to which squadrons for which tasking. The Spitfire Mk XIV went to interceptor and air defense roles, high-altitude combat over occupied territory within practical combat radius, and eventually to anti-V1 operations, where it proved the most effective destroyer of flying bombs of any Spitfire variant, accounting for approximately 300 kills. That number reflects something important about the Mk XIV's performance. The V1 flying bomb cruised at around 400 miles per hour and required a fighter that couldn't only reach it, but close on it in level flight or a shallow dive. The Mk XIV's top speed of approximately 446 miles per hour gave it the necessary margin where earlier Mks could barely catch a V1 at all. The Mustang went to long-range strategic escort, to the deep penetration missions over Germany that broke the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot cadre through attrition. General Doolittle's February 1944 decision, made the same month as the AFDU evaluation, to allow 8th Air Force fighter pilots to pursue and destroy the enemy rather than stay tied to close formation escort, amplified the Mustang's strategic impact precisely because its range let it follow Luftwaffe fighters wherever they went. German pilots could no longer break off combat and dive away to safety, knowing the escort would have to return to the bombers. The Mustang followed. Across the spring and summer of 1944, Mustang pilots in the European theatre claimed the destruction of more enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat than any other American fighter, by a significant margin. That record stands alongside the AFDU's combat parameter ranking of the Mk XIV without contradicting it. Different missions, different metrics, different verdicts, all simultaneously true. The AFDU evaluation conclusion understood this. These two aircraft should never be enemies. That line wasn't a compliment to the Mustang's close combat capabilities, and it wasn't a concession by the Spitfire's advocates. It was a statement that the two machines occupied different operational niches and that comparing them for a hypothetical pure dogfight championship missed the point of what each one was built to do. The evaluation had already stated the combat parameter rankings plainly. The conclusion acknowledged that ranking without using it to propose reassigning the Mustang's mission. What the AFDU report does not support is the inversion of the belief correction argument. The claim that the Spitfire Mk XIV was therefore the better aircraft in some global sense that collapses range, strategic utility, and production reality into a single verdict. The report didn't rank the aircraft globally. It ranked them on 6 specific parameters under the conditions of the February 1944 trial, using the Mustang III variant, then in RAF service, against a Mark XIV development aircraft. The Spitfire Mk XIV ranked higher on climb, turning circle, and rate of roll. The Mustang ranked higher on range and dive. Speed was a draw. That is the complete picture. The very much better line applies to climb specifically and should be read exactly as written, no more expansive than its context supports. The contested element of the report is worth naming directly. The specific combination of Report108 as a designation, February 1944 as the precise date, and RAF Wittering as the trial location appears together in modern secondary sources rather than in an independently located primary archival document. The AFDU's actual internal numbering scheme, as evidenced by a March 1944 Mustang tactical trial document that survives in the World War II Aircraft Performance Archive under the reference AFDU/3/21/36, used composite codes rather than simple sequential integers like 108. The underlying comparative trial between Spitfire Mk XIV and Mustang III is well documented. Its verdict language appears consistently across multiple independent secondary sources, including the World War II Aircraft Performance Archive and Aviation History Forum records that reproduce the evaluation text in detail, with the parameter-by-parameter findings, including the exact phrasing, "The Spitfire 14 is very much better on maximum climb," consistent enough to treat as reliable transmission of the original evaluation language. But AFDU Report 108 as a specific archival designation, February 1944 as a precise date rather than an approximate period, and Wittering as a confirmed location should be carried with appropriate uncertainty. The evaluation happened. Its verdicts are documented. The specific catalogue reference is transmitted through secondary sources. That calibration matters as a matter of intellectual honesty. It does not change the argument. Whether the report is referenced as AFDU Report 108 or as AFDU's early 1944 comparative tactical trial, the institutional origin remains identical. The RAF's own Operational Evaluation Unit, under Fighter Command and the Air Ministry, produced the climb verdict in wartime language for operational use. The belief correction does not depend on a specific archival shelf number. It depends on the institutional identity of the body that produced the assessment and the professional context in which it was produced. A counter-argument worth addressing directly. The Mustang III tested wasn't the fully optimized P51 variant. The V1650-3 engine was replaced by the more powerful V1650-7 after April 1944. The Razorback canopy configuration was less capable in terms of pilot visibility than the P51D's bubble canopy. A later trial against a V1650-7 Mustang in P51D configuration might have produced somewhat different figures on some parameters. The V1650-7 delivered more power at altitude, and the P51D's visibility improvements were real. That is true. But the evaluation wasn't testing hypothetical future Mustangs. It was testing the Mustang that was flying escort missions at the time the report was written. The aircraft assignment decisions commanders were making in February 1944 were based on February 1944 aircraft. The AFDU evaluated the real comparison, not the best-case one. That makes the evaluation more operationally honest, not less rigorous. A second counter-argument. The Spitfire Mk XIV produced in February 1944 was itself a development aircraft, a conversion of the Mark VIII fuselage rather than a fully equipped late production Mark XIVe. The trial may not represent the peak Mark XIV configuration either. Also true. Both aircraft were evaluated as they existed at the moment of evaluation, in the configurations available to operational squadrons at that time. That is precisely the right standard for an evaluation whose purpose was to inform real deployment decisions, rather than determine which aircraft had the better theoretical performance ceiling. The dive advantage the Mustang held, the Mustang pulls away, but less markedly than against the Spitfire 9, reflects the aerodynamic efficiency of the laminar flow wing at high speed in shallow angle dives. The Mustang's lower drag characteristics gave it an acceleration advantage the Mk XIV's heavier nose and bigger propeller disc couldn't match once both aircraft were pointed downhill and accelerating. That advantage was real. A Mustang pilot who got away in a dive was harder for a Mk XIV to follow than for a Mk IX. The qualifier "less markedly" tells you something important, though. The gap had narrowed as the Griffin's power increased. The AFDU noted this without overstating it. The Mk14 wasn't flawless in the comparison. But the combat metrics where it led, climb, turning circle, roll rate, were the ones that determined who had positioning advantage going into an engagement, not who could accelerate away from one they'd already lost. The broader institutional record confirms what the February 1944 report represents. The AFDU had originated in October 1934, moved through wartime locations including Northolt and Duxford, where it was operating as early as 1942, arranging comparative test flights and developing tactical doctrine, and would eventually be absorbed into the Central Fighter Establishment at RAF Tangmere in 1945. Where its functions continued as the Air Fighting Development Squadron. Across that entire period, its output served the same purpose, giving commanders professionally grounded analysis of how British fighters compared to each other and to their opponents. The unit produced reports on the FW-190 when it first appeared, on captured aircraft brought back from France and North Africa, on successive marks of Spitfire and Hurricane and Tempest as they entered service. The Mk14 versus Mustang III evaluation was one document in a substantial archive of similar work, produced by a unit whose institutional credibility rested on the operational relevance of its findings. The modern popular consensus about the P-51's superiority draws heavily on its strategic indispensability, which is real, documented, and consequential, and sometimes folds that strategic verdict into a general combat superiority claim that the AFDU evaluation specifically does not support. The National Museum of the USAF describes the P-51 as possessing excellent range and maneuverability, and operating primarily as a long-range escort fighter. That framing is accurate for the Mustang's primary mission. Excellent range and maneuverability as a long-range escort isn't the same claim as superior maneuverability in a close engagement air combat trial at altitude. The AFDU evaluated the latter. On climbing, the metric most directly relevant to positioning advantage in aerial combat, to who gets the altitude edge before the merge, to who controls the terms of the initial engagement, the Mk14 was very much better. The question the AFDU evaluation was designed to answer was operational, not historical. In February 1944, with Overlord planning generating urgent aircraft allocation decisions, with the Luftwaffe maintaining high-altitude interception capability against Allied aircraft over occupied Europe, commanders needed to know what the Mk14 would and wouldn't do relative to the Mustang III already in RAF service. The AFDU told them. It told them the Mk14 would outclimb, outturn, and outroll the Mustang III in a close combat engagement, that the speeds were essentially matched, and that the Mustang's range made it indispensable for a mission the Mk14 couldn't perform, regardless of its combat metrics. Both truths were written into the same document, in the same evaluation period, by the same evaluators. The RAF didn't have to choose between them. The allocation that followed reflected that dual truth. The Mk14 went to interceptor and air defence roles, where its combat metrics were the relevant measure. The Mustang went to long-range strategic escort, where its range was the relevant measure. That division wasn't a concession to the Mustang's superiority in close combat. It was a rational assignment of different tools to different problems. The kind of operational thinking the AFDU's evaluation was designed to support. The lasting significance of the evaluation isn't that it settles a discussion about the best fighter of the Second World War, a question that collapses the apples and oranges distinction the evaluation itself refused to make. The significance is that it demonstrates the Spitfire over Mustang air combat ranking wasn't invented retrospectively by British aviation enthusiasts constructing a flattering national narrative. Professional evaluators working for the RAF's Operational Judgment Unit wrote it in wartime language under operational conditions for commanders who would act on it. The burden of proof runs the other way. The modern assumption that ranking the Spitfire Mk XIV above the Mustang III in close combat parameters requires special advocacy or wishful thinking overlooks the people who had that argument first and finished it with professional authority in February 1944. The RAF could rank the Griffon Spitfire's climb as very much better, and still depend on the Mustang to win the larger air war. That wasn't a contradiction held together by diplomatic language. It was an accurate description of what two genuinely different aircraft were for, assessed honestly enough to give both their due in the same document. One filled the interception role over defended territory. The other flew missions no single-engine aircraft had been able to sustain before. Both were essential. Neither could replace the other. The report didn't wait for modern arguments to decide where the Mk XIV ranked. It decided in February 1944, when aircraft assignment still meant who came home. If you want more stories like this, wartime documents, operational verdicts, and the gap between what the record says and what the popular narrative assumes, subscribe.